Thank you so much, Una. You're amazing. And welcome to all of you. We're thrilled that you're joining us for this conversation on how we can actually make this happen, how we can operationalize DEI in our tech companies to make real and meaningful progress on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm so delighted to be joined by these incredible 5 DEI leaders, and I will just introduce them very briefly to you, and then we will dive right into our conversation. Beatriz Acevedo is an immigrant entrepreneur, community leader, philanthropist, and CEO and co-founder of the fintech startup Summa Wealth. She's a multi-award-winning, sought-after speaker and a champion and mentor for the next generation of Latinx leaders. Welcome, Beatriz.
Thank you.
Iris Bohnet is a behavioral economist and professor at Harvard Kennedy School, where she co-directs the Women and Public Policy program, which is where I have the great joy and pleasure of working with her. Iris is also the author of the award-winning book, What Works? Gender Equality by Design. Great to have you, Iris.
Delighted to be here.
Trey Boynton is the Senior Director of Inclusion and Collaboration Strategy and Inclusive Solutions at Cisco, where she leads bodies of work to build and deliver on fairness promises and equity aspirations at scale. Her ultimate goal is to reduce barriers to brilliance. I just love that. Great to have you, Trey.
So good to be here.
James Heightington is the Global Head of Measurement and Reporting at Google, where he leads corporate social responsibility reporting for underrepresented communities. Prior to Google, he served as Chief Digital Officer at the nonprofit GLAAD and participated in President Obama's White House LGBT tech briefing. Welcome, James. And finally, Lanaya Irvin is the CEO of Coqual, formerly Center for Talent Innovation. She spent more than a decade at Bank of America Securities and is a global business executive, thought leader, and frequent speaker on topics of workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion. Welcome to you all, and let's dive right in. Iris, I'd like to start with you. You not only study what works to promote DEI in organizations, but you've also worked directly with lots of companies to help implement some of these evidence-based practices. What would you say is the most important thing companies need to understand about making real progress on DEI?
Well, I can only just build on what we heard the CEOs talk about earlier today, that in fact DEI is not going to work unless it is a real business imperative. DEI is not a nice to have, but it is a must have. But of course, then the question for our panel really is, what does it mean? What does it mean when we make DEI a business imperative? And I sometimes use an acronym, ATM, to kind of describe how I think about this. ATM as in accessing the treasures of DEI. The A stands for awareness. So clearly we have to raise awareness. And the CEO panel also talked quite a bit about that at a deep level, not at a superficial level. We have to use diagnostics, we have to use data, we have to use evidence. We really have to understand to raise awareness. So that's the first. The T, very simple, tools. And we'll spend, I think, quite a bit of time on our panel talking about the toolbox, which is ever increasing, which is ever increasingly more evidence-based. So tools are very important. And then the M, clearly also relevant, is motivation. And that means KPIs, incentives, transparency, accountability, and all of that kind of combined will help us really live up to our mandate to turn DEI into a business imperative.
Thank you, Iris. Do any of the rest of you want to chime in on this? Trey, I'll jump to you to build on something that Iris just mentioned, which is metrics and data. These are obviously critical to making real progress on DEI. And in fact, this is action 3 in the ACT report. Mm-hmm. What are the data infrastructure pieces that tech companies need to have in order to collect and track and report on data, and what should this data be?
So it's data is everything. I cannot stress the importance. And so James, I'm with you, friend. Like, data is everything because it tells you the story. There is so much, and it's not just the data, it's the insights and the fluency to understand what the data is telling you. So it's this 3-piece component of what are you measuring? What is currently in existence? Because that gives you baseline. Where are we right now? What do we need to be thinking about? What's happening in the company? Where do we see this across not just representation? Because I think people stop at representation. I'm interested in participation. I'm interested in promotions. I'm interested in persistence and attrition. I'm interested in a whole bunch of things of how is the company being experienced by various groups. And that's what tells me what's going on. And then when I can get a readout, and I have to have both the insights to know what the numbers are, in addition to being able to say, this is what it's telling me, because that's where you then do the design. The design then happens because you know in this process, if you think about if you think about applicant progression through a hiring cycle, you can look and see where people are entering in. What's the candidate pool? How do you then get to first interview? How do you then get to the hiring offer? And you can see, because who's involved in each one of those decisions. Recruiting is involved in one phase. The candidates, the hiring managers, and an interview panel is involved in the next phase. And then a hiring manager makes a decision, which then lets you target where in the process you see the data starting to showcase in a way that's not what you want. It's not in the service of your outcome. That's just one example of a process, knowing that we have thousands of processes happening. Hence, data is everything. Data is royal. Let us honor it and treat it and help it undergird me. When I go into a room with an executive, with a leader, with anyone, I said, let me tell you what the story is. Let me show you by the numbers. Here's what's going on. Here's what's happening. And therefore, here's the opportunity in front of you. We make decisions every day, thousands of decisions. Your decision matters because it will show up in the data in this way, this way, this way, and this way. What questions do you have?
Yeah, I think, just to add to that about data is everything, king and queen, right? You can't really improve what you can't measure. So although it might be scary, just like when I step on the scale every Monday that I start a new diet and I don't want to see the number, you need to see the number. You need to know where you stand, where you start, and where you want to go and set those goals. So I think as scary as it is, you take a deep breath and you look internally really hard at where you are, but at least you know what is going to be that path to get you to where you want to be. And, for companies, which I know there's a lot of them, including Snap here today at the conference, who are part of Pledge LA, which is an initiative of the Annenberg Foundation and the City of Los Angeles for the mayor. We give that accountability and that measurable platform through a company called Pluto, and it's free to everybody. So for anybody wanting to take that deep dive and they don't have it in place in their own companies, we'd love to be a resource there. And it's anonymous, and you're able to set your own goals, and you're able to see your progress. And it's a really great resource that Pledge LA makes available for all of its members. So I encourage everyone to take advantage of it if you don't have it set up already individually in your own companies.
If I might build on something, Trey, I think what you said really resonates with me and about the data and what we're measuring here. And I think, representation is kind of the currency and the bar that we've set in our industry. That's what everybody reports out on in their diversity reports and what the headlines say and, what elected officials are. And that's great, but representation is a lagging indicator. It's a backwards looking metric. I call it literally counting heads at desks at the end of a calendar year. It doesn't tell you about how you got there. So we do need that, and that's important for accountability, but that's not the only thing we need to do the work. We need to be looking, Trey, like you said, at hiring, at attrition, at progression, at performance reviews, at all of these contributing factors, and that's where a lot of the levers lie. So I would challenge you to say yes to representation, but that may not be enough for what you need internally. That's nice for accountability, but we need more data internally to do the work and inform the work.
Here's a great question from the audience on this topic. And friends, I encourage you to submit questions throughout. We'll take as many of them as part of our panel as we possibly can. The question is, how do we track dimensions of diversity, right, and dimensions of identity as part of the hiring process while ensuring that candidates aren't judged on those metrics, right, without making candidates feel like this will be part of the evaluation? This is, by the way, a question that I get from companies all the time as well.
So I'm happy to jump in here and talk a bit about the merits of evaluations where we don't see the demographic characteristics or even the CV of the applicant. Mm-hmm. And that's, quite an extreme way of answering that question, Siri. But one company that is called Applied, as in applied science, they literally do that. And they have found that diversity emerges when we actually shield ourselves from some of those demographic characteristics that might blind us literally from seeing quality where it really is. So I'm quite intrigued by the idea of focusing on work sample tests of different types of evaluation tools rather than people's names, where they come from, and even their CVs, which I know for many feels like totally countercultural. But I'd urge us to experiment more in that space and kind of try to see, what tools really lead to better and more inclusive outcomes.
I agree, and you can capture data. The beauty of a process is oftentimes you can break that process and then kind of rebuild it. And so if you would like to capture that data, you can also see, well, where does that actually fit into the talent acquisition process? Where does that fit into a resume screen? Where does that fit into, who actually gets through? Because it might not fit, and they may be two separate channels in the same work stream or same process. And so that you might be able to capture that data, yes, but where it actually fits into which resumes and or seen which candidates and are interviewed and are ultimately kind of brought into the workforce, or they don't necessarily need to be kind of brought together. And so I think that when we talk about kind of the structural kind of challenges that many companies face, I think oftentimes it's because not only do we look at a process as a straight line instead of a series of lines, right? It's an end to end, yes, but at the same time you are kind of capturing inputs throughout that process. And so no, I don't think that there's a problem with gathering that data, but there is a way to keep it from influencing the outcome of the candidate's entry into your organization.
What are some of the very practical ways in which the organizations that you all work in have created this data infrastructure and have made not only the collection of all of this data possible, but actually shared this data with managers and with employees in a way that it can help to change their behavior? Because that's the purpose in large part of collecting this data, right? We're not just collecting it to be able to report it out once a year. We want to use it as a tool to help us get to where we want to go. Trey, I know that you are doing some really innovative things with this at Cisco.
Yeah, I think what I would talk to, we call it data at the point of decision-making to drive inclusive decision-making, right? So where do you get your data and how often do you have access? So we turn our data on for our leaders. So at any given point, some of our senior leaders at the organization have access to what we call their family portrait. It's their team portrait. It's your snapshot of right now where you are. And we built a suite of solutions that we call diverse talent accelerators, if we're going to continue the recruiting conversation, but really the workforce planning conversation. When we think about workforce planning, thinking about hiring, we should be thinking about inclusion, we should be thinking about representation, and we should be thinking about those things simultaneously, because it's not in the best interest of the team if we're doing those pulled apart. If you don't have a sense of where you are, you don't know where you need to go. It's the reason why we have on our little maps and GPS that little thing that says, where am I right now? And then that tells me how far away I am. So the snapshot, what we call the suite of solutions, the first is called Smart Insights. It's right now on the moment, and it gives you at any given point where your gaps are, where your metrics are right now as it relates to what we can measure currently. And we're trying to expand that. So it's gender globally, ethnicity in the US. We focus on that. What we also are doing is expanding. And as we continue to evolve, and I think there's an opportunity when we think about data, when you are either evolving your systems, whenever you're pulling out a big system or upgrading, what a wonderful opportunity to add diversity metrics, diversity data, those pieces that allow you to then see more clearly. And so for us, we start with the snapshot. We then move into where is the talent? I'm sure each one of us has heard, yes, I want to hire a diverse team, but where do I look? Okay, we solved that for you. We actually have a map of the world that says, if you actually look in Atlanta for engineers, or in Texas for customer success managers, or in engineers, you're looking for women, because right now India is graduating women at a 60-40 rate right now in some of our STEM schools and STEM programs. You can find the talent. It's literally here on a map. And so if you look in these places, the applicant pool is going to be full of talent. Then you move to what I call breaking the unicorn practice, which is I'm going to write a description so specific that it is the most magical person who has rainbows and fairy sprinkles that literally doesn't exist. And so when we create a job description that is so narrow and so specific, of literally, I couldn't apply for some of these things that if people write them so specifically, you cannot do that. How do we then work and partner? And we partner with Textio to make an open, inclusive job application so that our recruiters are writing job applications that apply to the whole. And what we see are returns like faster fill dates, a more diverse panel, a more diverse candidate pool, because we take out jargon that pushes people away. Because here's what we know the research says. We know that people don't apply if they don't see themselves in 100% of the criteria, whereas some people apply if they only see themselves in 60%. Let's take that out of the equation and let's actually make a job description that says, most of you, many of you can see yourselves in this. And then we move to the last piece, which is Smart Select, which is creating diverse interviewer panels, because what we know is when representation happens, we know that diverse hiring, because also for a candidate, you not only see yourself in a panel, you see the panel, but the panel also has a different set of backgrounds that can see a candidate for all the skills that they bring. So we take it throughout the entire life cycle, and we have digitized solutions for each of those to set that up through the candidate life cycle.
Can I add something on just diverse teams? When we, it's such a big, broad concept to just say diverse teams and talk about gender and ethnicity. I speak to a ton of CEOs who think that they're doing amazing because they already have a Latino kid from Stanford, a Black kid from Harvard, a woman with disabilities from another Ivy League school. And that is not the point, right? Like for me, who, throughout my career, I've only hired diverse kids and teams because that's the audience that I serve. And certainly I benefit tremendously from that. You have to dig deeper. Do I have a kid who, obviously I have all Latino kids and engineers and CEOs and COOs. I have no problem finding them, by the way, also amazing, amazing talent at every single level. But do I have a dreamer kid? Do I have a kid who was previously incarcerated? Do I have somebody from a foster home? Do I have an Afro-Latino? Do I have an LGBTQ Latino? I mean, there's so much intersectionality within our own community. So for me to say I have majority women and all Latinos is not enough when we're talking about diverse teams. I need the diversity in every single aspect of their lives, that they're going to come in and enhance my organization. Those are the people that I'm super serving. And those are the people really that America is super serving now. 40% of America is diverse. So to keep thinking that these are niche, small teams is not a reality. We saw from the census, just from Latinx, 51% of the growth in the last decade was from this demographic. So to keep thinking that diversity is charity or it's the right thing to do is an incredible mistake when it comes to how you are going to be running a successful business. So I encourage people who think that they are diverse because they fill the quota of enough women or enough kids of color from Ivy League schools, that they rethink the experiences that kids from other backgrounds, other socioeconomic levels, other experiences can bring to the table as they are building their organizations and as they are building products, services, and companies to serve precisely that demographic. It's a mistake not to have those insights in your rooms.
Now, speaking of running successful companies, all the data that we've talked about and these DEI metrics, they're obviously shaped by the organizational processes like hiring, promotion, compensation, performance evaluation that companies deploy. Lanaya, I'd like to ask you, given that these processes and structures are at the center, and our theme for the whole day with the ACT report is to talk about structural change, how should companies rethink and redesign some of these organizational processes to minimize bias and to ensure that they're providing a genuinely level playing field for everybody?
Well, first, I'm just glad that this conversation started out this way, because oftentimes we're centering conversations around hiring and around representation as it relates to specifically that lever. I think that the idea of being interested less in representation but participation, I think is something that's powerful, and everyone's kind of shared that here. But I'll be honest. The past 18 to 20 months have given corporate leaders, given all of us, quite frankly, but given corporate leaders free license almost to break most every process, free license to disrupt bias. I mean, again, there's been this awakening to systemic barriers, systemic racism, access to healthcare, other structural inequities. And then, of course, the pandemic has pulled forward, right, this accelerated change in the way that we work. So now is kind of the moment, right? And so what I would encourage, companies to think about is, metrics and measurement that may exist today, all of that without first evaluating kind of the structural bits. It's not going to yield the progress you're looking for, right? And so you have to spend time before redesigning anything, really looking and auditing that talent system end to end and looking for those weaknesses, right? Where the bias creeps into, of course, talent acquisition, your performance routines, right? Look at the advancement data, look at compensation beyond just the pay equity exercise, right? How did you get there in the first place, right? And so, we at Copal, we recently launched the first in a series of 3 reports focused on equity. And in that research, we look at talent systems, right? What's creating barriers to success or impacting one's ability to thrive, right? And be at least fairly rewarded for their contributions. So we looked at performance, promotion, pay. We knocked the gloves off a little bit and we double clicked and looked at class and colorism. And, the findings revealed inequity and bias throughout. On the performance evaluations front, for example, it was clear. Most talent wants to see their performance evaluations reflect their contributions in the organization. Some cohorts didn't have that benefit, right? And Black and Latino professionals in particular, our data show that they feel they're being judged by different criteria, right, than their peers in their performance evaluations. It's not clear. In fact, they're twice as likely to report that they're being evaluated on different criteria based on their performance evals. And when we look at promotion, again, advancement, the opportunity for that is not evenly distributed. Black and Latino professionals were more likely to report that either they're being promoted very slowly or being passed over for promotion, in favor of equally or less qualified peers. And Black women, for Black women, it's even more acute. And they're 4 times more likely to feel passed over as it relates to promotion for less qualified colleagues. So then we're looking at promotion, we're looking at performance evaluation, which often leads to opportunity for development for promotion in the way you're going to get paid, correct? And, and we've known from previous research that some cohorts are more likely to be discounted for their contributions, have their competence questioned in the work environment. And so we wanted to, get more granular about this nuance that isn't talked about as much in corporate spaces, colorism. And so we looked at it as it relates to promotions, and we found that professionals with dark skin were 3 times more likely to report being passed over for promotion. This is including respondents of all races and ethnicities. So an interesting, extreme kind of variance between in Latino communities between, light skin versus dark skin, and the way that individuals are being perceived in the work environment. We looked at, pay equity. And of course, we found, women at the intersection of gender, women across the board obviously perceive and are aware that their pay may be less than their peers, which makes sense because we understand that the pay gap there. And for Black women, they're acutely aware of this difference. But the large concern here across the board for women and employees more broadly is just this lack of transparency in how pay decisions are made, right? That's what creates a lot of the anxiety. That's what creates a lot of the perceived lack of fairness. And then, one other point that at the intersection of gender and parenthood, it's worth noting, we did see that the fatherhood bonus persists, right? We wanted to see if it showed up in our data as well. And so, there's this, so you have these discounts that happen at the intersection of race, compound at the intersection of gender as well. But then there's still this, this idea that, men and fathers, when they ask for a raise, they're seen as providers of the household, right? They need to keep income and a roof over their head. Men in our study were far more likely to say that, yes, their manager advocates for increases in pay. And then there was an even additional kind of bonus for those who happen to be parents. All this to convey the simple point that bias is shaping our interactions. And so it impacts our careers on a daily basis. And so companies need to just take a step back, look at internal processes kind of as the foundation for equity, right? We have the behavioral, which we're all working on with our teams, but there's the structural piece that you kind of need to get both right. And, look to make some systemic changes so then you can actually drive some accountability at all levels of the organization, right? Because, we can rely on our humanness to not get in the way, but to some extent, that's a failure, right? And so, there's tremendous payoffs here. We looked at kind of the benefits and ways to scale points. Actually doing this work to kind of audit and reimagine existing processes, when you increase perceived fairness in pay and performance evals and promotion, all the things you would expect, increased employee engagement, right? Trust in the company, most critically to retention, loyalty to the firm, intent to stay. And so, I would say, as a takeaway, something simple we can all just kind of have in our pocket. We put forth some kind of equity principles, and I think they're important when we think about operationalizing it, because you can just keeps it here for all of us to hold in front. And we lay out these 5 principles that you might consider when you're redesigning a process. We're calling it stacks, right? Specificity, transparency, accountability, courage, and sustainability, right? So specificity, it's, rather than discussing equity and inclusion as this abstract concept, feel good thing, use data, right? To identify the areas for opportunity and map things out. Be very kind of intentional about what you're going to do with hiring, development, promotion. Transparency. The data shows, and obviously we tend to speak from the employee voice. It's important you be as transparent as possible with your teams. Bring clarity around processes connected to pay. Your promotion committees, or how employees are ranked, or how feedback is given. Bring some transparency into the processes, and to the extent that you want to make, kind of representation data and those things visible to your teams or externally. Transparency actually helps in driving accountability, right? And accountability is key. You got to hold leaders accountable for success, whether that's tying it to compensation, adding it to any manager or people's performance evaluations, the what they do and the how they do it. And then the courage and sustainability is, look, you're going to have to lean boldly into this work, right? And in some cases in the face of opposition, but that's what leaders do, right? When you're iterating upon a product, when you're, you're kind of reshaping a strategy, you push for what you think is best outcome for the organization. You do that here. And the sustainability is just, embedded into the organization, and you'll ensure that the fruits of your labor are felt long-term.
Yeah, there's some phenomenal examples and tangible takeaways in there. Iris, what does the academic research suggest might be other effective ways to promote DEI?
I am completely aligned with Lanaya, and I love that you focus our attention on debiasing processes. Again, behaviors, super important, but processes are tangible, and we have to audit them. And then we have to, in addition to using data to diagnose, and I think that's a really important message. In addition to using the data to diagnose, we also have to use data to evaluate whether what we're doing is actually working. So I actually want to borrow from all of you in the tech sector, the A/B testing, and that's exactly what we do in academia now. So, for example, I'll give you three examples. So we tested whether sharing self-evaluations in performance appraisals is actually good or bad. Right? It's a common practice. Many organizations do it. And you could have lots of theories why this is helpful or hurtful. But of course, if you fear that some of us are more comfortable shining the light on ourselves. That could be by race, could be by gender, could be by sexual orientation, by nationality, geography, then maybe that is a vicious circle. That starts a vicious circle where I undervalue my performance. I'm sharing that with my manager. My manager has a curve to fit and kind of goes with the flow. And that's exactly what we kind of found. And in fact, not sharing self-evaluations helped one group in particular in our study with a multinational financial services company. It was women of color. Women of color gave themselves the harshest self-evaluations. And I'm generalizing here for a moment. We have more detailed variables on specific races, but the generalization is true. Women of color gave themselves the harshest self-evaluations. When we disrupted that process, managers, in fact, lifted the women up because they weren't anchored at the low self-evaluations. That's the kind of work that I think is super important. I'm just giving maybe one more quick example. Not everything is formal. Much of the inequity happens informally. So also think about the support that people give. We sometimes give and get. We sometimes refer to this as performance support bias. That not everyone is invited to the cool meetings, not everyone has access to the important partners, etc., etc. And so that's a study that we did with a law firm, and we could show that this inequity really starts in the first year when these first-year associates join the law firm. Not only did the mostly straight white male partners choose people who look like them, they also chose first-year associates who graduated from the same law school. Now, that's not a very hard problem. They now centralized work allocation. So it used to be the case that partners just chose people they wanted to work with, and that then created those inequities in support. But now they have a central work allocation system where a centralized partner and a little team make sure everyone gets access to these opportunities, and they track it over time. So I'm so with Trey. The tracking, the sharing the data, that's a process innovation fact too, that many managers don't do this intentionally. But bias is everywhere. And if we help them keep track of what they're doing, we might actually move the needle more successfully than we have in the past.
I'd love to add an example very quickly. And I'm not a DEI expert like everyone else. I'm just an expert on my own community. But, just exactly to your point of how some demographics, in particular women and women of color, undervalue themselves, clearly as a CEO of a Latinx-led company, I was never, and as a woman myself, I was never going to pay women in my companies any less than men. But I do have to say that 99.99% of the Latinas in my own companies were reacted very differently when they got promotions than the Latino men. So this is not even going outside our own cohort. And the Latinas would always have the same answer. They were incredibly grateful. They would say, I'm so grateful for this opportunity. You're never going to regret it. I'm going to work harder. I was not asking them to work harder. And they never asked what was the promotion? What was the money? Was it comparable to anyone else? Was there nothing? The men were incredibly fierce negotiators. And these were Latino men, so not even white men. Latino men, probably some less qualified than the Latina women. And they would make me so exhausted negotiating their bonuses, their time off, their work from home when it wasn't even a thing. It was unbelievable the way they negotiated, but understanding that not all your employees are the same and that the cultural nuances to where we come from. Latina women from birth, we hear from our mothers and from our grandmothers that calladita te ves más bonita, which translates to when you are quiet, you look prettier, right? So stay in your lane, keep your head down, be grateful for what you've given is something we grow up with. My brother never grew up with that. The men don't grow up with that. So you could see the difference that once you're in the workforce, and I understand there's a lot of inequities, there's a lot of racism in the workforce, but we also bring some stuff from our own families to the workplace. For myself, I have an incredibly hard time negotiating my salary, my equity to this day. I have a stomach ache because I feel I'm disappointing my mother and my grandmother for not being grateful, for not being the good girl they raised and that I should be at work. So I continue to have this struggle, but as managers, as CEOs, as anyone, to understand that from all the different communities and be able to coach the younger generations, the next generations of leaders of color, of women, of people with disabilities to use their voice, to be vocal, to be in a safe place also to be able able to do that is really, really crucial. So for me, always when I think about equal pay, and we see that Latinas are at the very bottom of the pay equity list along with all the other women, but it is November when our time comes up to make the same. We get half of the dollar. I always think, are white men really waking up every day thinking, how do we pay just Latinas a lot less than everyone else? Or is it the normal racism that we all experience as women, plus what we bring from our culture and from our homes and from our, just years of stay quiet, stay in your place, don't put your head up, and just be grateful. So I think you need to really balance both of those things so we can coach the next generations and also obviously make companies accountable.
Woo! That's a word. Okay. I had to follow that because I was having feelings. Here's what I think is so critical that you all have highlighted. Like, honestly, this is about understanding the dynamics of intra-group and intergroup, because the data will tell you what's broken. The audits, the systems, the actions to take, the testing. But what you have to know is at the end of the day, when you have supervisors across difference, the research shows is that women of color, people of color, queer folks, people who identify any dimensions of difference, there's a gap in supervision. They get undermanaged, they get undercoached, they get undersponsored. That is just there. So what we have to do is understand what is the there. So let's peel it back. For people that are in a position of privilege, whatever that looks like. So if I am an able-bodied person where I identify and I have someone on my team who has a disability, I'm so scared of looking like I'm ableist that I won't give them the feedback that they need to be better to get promoted, to get the raise, to get the bonus, to be considered for this project. So what happens is we got to get back to the dynamics of why it's broken. The brokenness starts with the piece of understanding the dynamics of people are behind every data point. And that's why it's so critical. And I love that we keep tying it together. The data and the behavior, they have to get closer and closer and closer until they are just nestled, reinforcing each other. They are yin and yang. Because if we don't understand the promotion disparity, pay disparity, attrition disparity, pick a disparity, because we got a lot. When we look at it from that piece, we have to link back to the behavior to say, oh, this is a piece around leader capability. This is a leader coaching. How do we enable our leaders to name the fact that I'm kind of scared when I supervise someone different than me? It makes me a little uncomfortable and I don't want to seem like a jerk. So I'm not going to correct them on anything, which means that person will not get better at the stuff that they need that other people are getting coached with, because when we are similar, I'm more at ease. I'm more able to give that feedback. So I think it's this third dimension of having a diversity strategy, an inclusion strategy, a DEI strategy that involves understanding the dynamics at play at any given moment within any given process. That's critical. Woo, amen. Oh, y'all did so good. I'm so proud of us.
Amen, indeed. I want to turn to one final topic as our time is winding down, and that relates to Action 5 in the ACT report. We've been talking mostly about stuff that happens inside the four walls of a company. And Beatriz, thank you for connecting it to everything that happens in our lives outside of work. But there's also a very important aspect to DEI, which is our interactions with consumers, with suppliers, with the broader community. So James, I'd love to get your thoughts on specifically the product development process and how we can think about building DEI into all aspects of product development in tech companies.
Yeah, thank you, Siri. I want to thank you for how you asked the question too, which was around internal processes and how we're engaging with clients, customers, products as well, because those two things are related. And I think the first thing we need to do is make sure that everybody at our companies understand that those two things are related. I think in general, people tend to think of DEI as a specific problem, an HR problem, a PR problem, a legal problem, a business problem. DEI is not a specific problem. DEI is a generalized problem across every area of your company. And I think we need to evangelize that. We need to get people to understand it that way because it needs to be operationalized that way. The solutions need to be operationalized that way. At Google, we've done that by kind of tying it to our mission statement. Luckily, our mission statement lends itself to that. It's to be, to collect the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And there's a very short dot to connect between universal access and DEI. And we do that through focusing on a product inclusion and the design principles that we've put around that. But I think it's important to note that even though DEI is such a short jump from our corporate mission there, we still have to be incredibly intentional about embedding it in the product inclusion process. I think for us, it's important to embed it to product inclusion because product is the language our companies speak. That's what we do. That's the lifeblood of every aspect of the company is revolving around that. It might not be products for your company, but whatever it is, whatever is the core heart of your business, that's where DEI needs to be situated there. There's three things that we need to do or that we do at Google in order to do that. The first is that we need to prioritize underrepresented voices. We need to look at who's at that table and be very intentional about understanding who doesn't have a seat at that table. And we need to go and we need to seek those voices out. And I think that's about measuring who's there, having a data-informed approach to understanding all the dimensions of diversity, and then focusing on bringing those communities into the process. The second thing that I think that we need to do is think beyond minimum viable products. In tech, we are so used to launching and iterating later. And when you're launching, what you need to understand is you're launching for somebody. It's a subset of somebody, and it's probably the easiest subset of somebody to get to. And what we're saying when we do that is, we're okay with that being the core of the project or the product. And then we're just going to bolt the rest on later. And what we are seeing is products, AI, all of these things across the entire industry, not just at any one company, that's having to course correct as part of the product itself, as opposed to being built for all from the beginning. So I think it's important to do that at every stage of the product development process, starting with ideation, design, testing, research, marketing, all of those things. DEI needs to be a part of every one of those steps. We need to be inclusive at every single stage. And then the third thing that I think is important and that we do a lot of is recognizing that our company, our employees are not fully representative of the users and clients that we serve. There are gaps. We know that. We have the data to show that there are gaps. We can use that data to inform who we need to bring in. You cannot just outsource this to an employee resource group or a diversity council or even your HR department that way. And this is why we invest in testing, in research, in measurement, and all of these things to understand in partnerships with outside organizations like Coqual, who are fantastic partners for us, to understand where our gaps are, to tap the experts and the professionals to help us do that, to not be trying to revolve around unpaid labor here for that, but to do it that way, to identify and then fill those gaps at every stage of the process. I think the last thing I would say here is you notice I'm talking a lot about people. I know you asked me about products, but that's intentional. And that's because I think, we tend to think about our industry's greatest contributions in terms of technology. And that's fine. But what if that's only half of it? What if the point of our industry is not technology, but the people behind the technology? And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. At Google, we talk about moonshots a lot, right? These are radical solutions to huge problems that we can use breakthrough technology for. You'll notice technology was the last thing that I said on that list. When Alphabet set out to build self-driving cars, it wasn't because some engineer woke up one morning and was like, wouldn't it be cool if cars drove themselves? It's because we looked at data and saw that traffic accidents are one of the leading causes of death. And we thought, is there a way that technology can help intervene right now? So supporting people is not an afterthought of technology. Supporting people is the goal of technology. That's the entire purpose of what we are doing here. And if that's the case, and if we really believe that to be true, then we need to radically rethink our notion of why diversity is important. This is not about companies doing the right thing for a diverse group of people or doing them a favor by bringing them in and giving them a seat at the table. Flip that. This is about those people actually doing their companies a favor by pointing out how their products can be better, how their outreach can be better, how their sales can be better because of the gaps, what they're leaving on the cutting room floor, what these unaddressed markets are that, to Beatrice's point, are growing more and more rapid all the time. And that's how we're going to stay ahead of all of these things. So I kind of, to put a button on all of this, would say we tend to talk a lot about having a diversity problem. I don't think diversity is a problem. Diversity is a solution. Diversity is a solution to a different problem the company has. Let's be talking about what that problem is and talking about the solutions that DEI can provide to that.
I love that. Let's finish with a true, genuine lightning round. One sentence from each of you. What is the final message that you want to leave our audience with today? How can we, as the collective tech industry, make the most of this moment and make a real change on DEI once and for all? Let's start with Beatriz and then Lanaya, please.
Just building up on what you just said. Diversity is not charity. Diversity is the most incredible business opportunity to future-proof your brands and your companies.
Thank you, Beatriz. Lanaya.
And I'll offer up a reframe. Diversity, equity, inclusion is not a problem. It's an opportunity. And, for leaders in this room, this is where a bit of authenticity is okay. It's okay to be honest about your discomfort, your knowledge gaps. But we also have to be honest with ourselves about inequity and who's being left behind.
Thank you, Lanaya. Let's go to Iris and then Trey.
I'm going to say two very quick things. One we haven't talked about much yet, although Lanaya alluded to it, and that is that we also are in the midst of a care crisis right now. Let's not leave that moment, without attention to it. Let's join much of the rest of the world in this country, in the United States, by giving people care leave, including parental leave. Secondly, use the ACT report. Everything that we just talked about is in the ACT report. You can learn so much from the ACT report. Use it, implement it, act.
Thank you, Iris. Trey.
I think, with all due respect to Drucker, who said, culture eats strategy for breakfast, I would offer that if culture eats strategy for breakfast, inclusion sets the table.
Love it. Thank you, Trey. And finally, James.
Data is the answer, because data is the language that your company already speaks.
And that is precisely what you'll find in the ACT report. It gives you the tools to bring all of this to practice. It shows you the roadmap of how to actually make this happen. So thank you to all the fabulous speakers for joining us today. Thank you for joining us today. And friends, let's go and make it happen. Let's get it done.